We're all here today because we know that we need to reinvent the retail business. I want you to think for a moment, just think back 13 years ago. Do you remember this? 13 years ago, in 1999, there was a panic, right? We were afraid that the world would come to an end because of this menace called the Y2k problem. The world was supposed to stop. Computers would stop, airplanes would stop flying, trains wouldn't work, our cell phones would die in our hands. And then what happened? The world went on. The world went on. The next day, everything seemed to be fine, and we forgot about the problem. Instant amnesia set in. So we forgot about that problem. But technology keeps moving, and technology keeps improving. And so there really was a big change that happened. The world didn't come to an end. What happened is the technology continued to advance. The world has changed tremendously just in the last 10 years. In 2001, there were about 250 million people using the internet and about 500 million mobile phones in use. Today, those numbers have increased by a factor of 10. And next year, we're going to break the threshold of 3 billion internet users. That's about half of humanity that will be connected to the internet, exchanging information, ideas, and yes, shopping in your stores. What's happened is that we've changed the audience. So the computers didn't come to an end at Y2K. The computers continued to grow and expand and extend, and now the computers are embedded in everything. And they're starting to change us, and they're starting to change our behavior. You've seen this happen because there's a whole generation now that's grown up. A generation who's grown up with computers and internet access in their homes. And for those people, www doesn't stand for the World Wide Web. It stands for whatever, whenever, and wherever. This audience has grown up with the expectation that they command media consumption. They control it, and they define it, and they use it on their own terms. And we've seen the impact now in several industries, what happens when this audience starts to interact with them. We've seen, for instance, since 2000, here's your real Y2K problem. Since 2000, the music industry has plummeted from $48 billion of revenue to $11 billion in just a 10-year span. And interestingly, in the advertising business in the United States, we have a chart that looks almost exactly the same. Here's a chart from the 1950s until 1910. And just in the last 10 years, that industry has plummeted from a $60 billion industry to an $11 billion industry. This is the Y2K problem. This is the change that has hit us, and it's hit us in a big way, and it's beginning to affect the retail industry as well. But this audience, this activated audience, takes command of everything that it touches. And now that they are adults, they're starting to reprogram the world on their own terms. And we're seeing this happen across different regions of the world as this activated audience begins to express their political will. The Arab Spring last summer, in the London riots, those BlackBerry riots that broke out, and in the United States last year, the Occupy Wall Street movement that organically arranged itself, it organized itself, beginning in New York City, but within weeks, using social media, Occupy Wall Street expanded to about 900 cities worldwide. This is the activated audience, and they're very clear about how they communicate. The tools that they use to talk to each other, they're telling us. They're spray painting it on the wall. They're using social media to express themselves. And everywhere you go, and every time you see one of these demonstrations, you'll notice that these people are holding up their cell phones, and they're holding up their mobile cameras, and they're taking pictures. In just 2 weeks, after the demonstrations began in Tahrir Square, when you did a Google search for Egypt, Tahrir Square, 23 million photos had been uploaded by this audience. This is the active audience. Every 60 seconds, more than 200,000 Facebook statuses are updated. There are more than 200,000 photos uploaded. 700,000 Facebook statuses changed. There are 125,000 Twitter tweets, more than 700,000 Google searches, and a staggering 72 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute of the day. Data scientists predict that the sheer amount of data in the world is going to increase by a factor of 10 every 5 years at the rate that people are engaging and uploading content. This is starting to affect traditional media in a lot of ways. Most importantly, social media is finding a way to wrap itself around and integrate itself into every traditional medium. And so we're beginning to see social book services, social book clubs, social music services like Spotify, which I'm sure everybody here is familiar with. Now there are magazines that compose themselves on your tablet computer based on your friend's input, social magazines. And even television is beginning to be reshaped by social media. So social media is starting to transform the rate of change. It's starting to transform society. This participatory media is a fundamental long-term trend. It defines the second century of electronic media. This, my friends, is the future, and this is going to affect your business in profound ways. My thought for you today, my first question for you today is, your customer has evolved tremendously in the last 10 years. Has your business evolved to adapt to them? I'm going to take a look at this in a little bit more detail in a moment, because I want you to think about that question. Think about it carefully. This changes everything. The mobile phone has really been the thing that surprised most analysts. You know, in the last 10 years, we've seen the mobile phone absorb so many different features, electronic devices that we used to have to carry around, and other things that we used to have to carry around. At first, 10 years ago, a smartphone looked like this. It was a BlackBerry pager. It compressed your pager and your phone book and your telephone all into one handy device. And then we started to add in more applications. And so because the processing power in the phone was getting better, we could add in a clock, for example, and a calculator. And by around 2004 or 2005, the processor in the phone was powerful enough for us to start to add in an MP3 player or FM radio. Even GPS began. But the real turning point was 2007 with the advent of the true smartphone, the smartphones that we see today, the smartphones that we carry around today. Because at that point, the phone was powerful enough to not just play back video, it could also record video and photos and voice. And so these became true miniature computers that we carried in our pocket. And along the way, we stopped carrying those other devices. We no longer need to carry around electronics like video cameras. And so we've seen whole businesses shift, because they're not selling these electronic devices anymore. And so companies like Sony and Sharp are having a tremendous amount of pressure right now, the consumer electronics companies, because we simply don't need to carry those devices. So just the span of 10 years, the mobile phone has collapsed all these different devices into pure software, into software capability. It doesn't stop there. With the introduction of downloadable apps, you can extend the functionality of your phone just by clicking on a button. You can download something to your phone instantly. So for €1, you can add capabilities to your phone. Again, previously, it was something you had to buy. Last week, I was in Hong Kong, and I visited the students at the Polytechnic University. And they showed me their multimedia editing room, where in the past, they had to have a whole editing suite, all that equipment that you need to record and mix music. Today, they do it on iPads. They've taken all the equipment that was in a professional recording studio, and they've shrunken it down to an app on a phone. We're literally vaporizing entire industries and turning them into software. The primary beneficiary of this is Apple Company. They have become the most valuable company in the world. And it's worth paying attention to how the revenue is comprised. You see, just in the last 5 years, since 2007, since the introduction of the iPhone now accounts for more than half of Apple's revenue. And if you add in the revenue from the iPad, this is the iPhone and the iPad, you can see that mobile devices comprise 2/3 of Apple's revenue. Their computers, all of their computers, laptop and desktop computers, they make less money off of that than they make off of the iPad, and that's a device that's only 3 years old. Mobile devices now comprise more than 2/3 of Apple's business. Apple has prioritized mobile. Have you prioritized mobile? Have you begun to make that your #1 priority? If not, you're really, really missing a gigantic opportunity. It's a significant opportunity because half the customers coming into your stores today are equipped with a mobile phone, with a smartphone, and half of them are shopping on that phone while they're in your store. Last week, again, I was in Hong Kong and Singapore, and there I was told that, in fact, my numbers are low. They said the problem's more acute in those markets because people are early adopters in those two cities, Singapore and Hong Kong. And in fact, they're doing shopping on their phone at a much higher rate. So in advanced countries where people have adopted this technology faster, you're starting to see even greater use of mobile phones inside of the shops. Now, every company that competes with Apple has adopted the same strategy. And so you're starting to see an invasion of tablet computers from just about every company, consumer electronics. They're all trying to catch up with Apple. They understand that the future of computing is mobile, that we're going to be connected all the time. Everybody will be connected to the web at all times. It's easy to see that in the next 10 years, every person on the planet will be connected to the internet, and they will have access to all of the information on the internet. Previously, you had the comfort of knowing that someone in your store didn't have other information when they were shopping. They were a captive customer. That's no longer the case. That customer is empowered. And remember, this is a customer that expects to control media on their own terms. So the digital network now is everywhere, and we carry it with us in our pockets. We have access to it at all times. For most retailers, the concept of the mobile phone has been presented as a form of payment, which I think is a fairly simplistic way to understand it. So for instance, you probably are familiar with NFC, near field communication, which most of the phone companies have introduced as a credit card replacement, another way to have a credit card on your phone. That's not a great idea. That's too simple of a notion. I'm going to talk to you about a more nuanced approach to this. Because you see, when you have a mobile phone, it connects you to this data layer that we can't otherwise see, and we're able to use the phone to see the data that's invisible to us. And we're starting to see people use this in novel and inventive ways, even video games on cell phones that overlay the real world. Just a few weeks ago, Google introduced something radically different. You know, there's been a battle between Google and Apple over patents in the mobile business. And now Google's decided to leapfrog into the future. And they introduced Project Google Glass. How many people are familiar with Google Glass? How many people have seen the video? All right, so this is a radical new technology. They've taken all the components of a cell phone, of a mobile phone, and they've miniaturized them. And so this is Sergey Brin. He's one of the founders of Google, and he's wearing this pair of glasses, but they're not like a typical pair of glasses. This is a little computer screen. That's a little camera. And over there on the right temple, that's a touchpad so that you can control the device. It also has voice command, and it has all of the components of a smartphone. And so a person wearing these glasses is able to see instant directions, maps, city information, city guide information, and they can take photos and videos and share them back with their friends. At this stage, Google Glass is still just a prototype. It's not a product that's available to consumers. But Google has started to release these devices to developers who are going to build applications on top of them, and we'll start to see a productized version of Google Glass probably as early as next year. What this means is that people will be wearing the information. They're going to be wearing this digital world as they walk into your stores. They'll have access to all information. The notion that somehow your store is going to be immune to this digital revolution, that's an idea from the past. What mobile does is it kind of completes the circuit. 10 years ago, when we were worrying about the Y2k problem, we had this old idea of the internet. We said, well, there's the real world, and we can digitize it, and then we'll kind of create a virtual world. There'll be these destinations on the internet that people visit. So we had a habit of use in those days, and the habit was that we would sit down in front of a computer and we would connect to the internet and we would go out to visit one of these places. And so it was almost like a real estate model that we had, where you had a destination in mind. You'd have to go to the destination. We had sessions. We used the internet for sessions. We connected to the internet and then we disconnected from the internet world. But with mobile, we're connected all the time. And so now we can bring all that information with us right into the shops, right into the retail environment. And along the way, what's happened is that we started to see things disappear. In Los Angeles, where I live, this is what a record shop looks like. They're vacant. This is what the video shops look like. They're vacant. This is what the Borders bookstore looks like in Los Angeles. It's also vacant. We vaporize these things. They're literally turning into software. And we're replacing them with this kind of a store, which is not like any store we've ever seen before. Because the Apple iTunes store and the Google Play store, and now these stores that come embedded in your mobile phone and in your tablet computer, they're really a combination of a shopping experience, a database, customer service, and it's all embedded and optimized for that device that we carry around with us. This is a radically different kind of competition that you're facing today. But this is the new playing field. So my take on this is that everything that can become information will become information. We're starting to see that. If there's any part of your business that is pure information, it will end up on the internet. If you don't put it there, someone else is going to put it there. That's a fundamentally important thing to be aware of. You must pay attention to this trend. You must study your business and say, what parts of my business are information that can end up on a digital device? It's going to get there one way or the other, whether you put it there yourself or whether it's put there by someone else. This is causing massive change, and I'm sure it causes a great shock to many of the companies that are present today. What I've discovered in my years of working with different companies who are dealing with digital disruption is that there are 3 ways to respond to digital disruption. The first one is to pretend that it's not happening. You're all familiar with the idea of the ostrich that buries its head in the sand. But have you ever seen this? This is the business executive who buries his head in the sand. I've seen this. This is the music industry in 1999. The music industry thought that they didn't have to deal with this digital revolution. They could pretend that it wasn't happening. And it took them 10 years and this collapse of their economics before they finally began to understand they needed to reinvent their business. The second approach that I've seen, which also is not successful, is to make an empty gesture. And so you'll have a company where the CEO says, okay, digital is important, and so we're going to put a team in charge of that. We're going to create a digital team, and they're responsible for the digital future. And so they delegate this task to a small team. The reason this won't work is that digital cuts across your entire business. And it's really part of every executive's responsibility. If you isolate digital, really, that's just a fake gesture. It's an empty gesture, and it will not succeed. Those teams will come back unsuccessful to you. There's really only one way I'm familiar with in being successful in digital media, and that's to embrace the change. To deal really honestly with the fact that the change is occurring right now, and you must confront it, and it affects every part of your business. And so dive in. Dive in 100%, embrace digital change. About 150 years ago, we have an interesting model of what happens when you're confronted with this dramatic change. This is the city of Chicago, where I spent some time. And we think of Chicago today as this modern metropolis, this booming city. But in 1871, it looked very different. The city burned down in a single night. The entire city burned to the ground. And the next morning, this is all that was left. The city was destroyed. And the town fathers, the businessmen, the merchants, they wanted to rebuild the city. And they needed to do it fairly quickly. The city was gigantic. They were building structures rapidly to replace it. But one architect came forth and gave them a different plan. He gave them a vision for how Chicago could be. Within 20 years, this is what the downtown of Chicago, State Street, looked like. So it's kind of an incredible rebirth. They rebuilt the entire city in a rather different way. The architect's name is Daniel Burnham. You might know him as the architect who designed the Flatiron Building in New York City or Union Station in Washington, D.C. But the truth is that he wasn't the best architect in Chicago. He really wasn't. What he was he was the best planner in Chicago. And he understood the importance of technology. And so when they rebuilt Chicago, he said, let's not build it the old way. We're not going to use wooden structures. We're not going to use masonry. Instead, let's use steel, because we have this new material, steel. And he developed a way to build a concrete foundation that floated on the soft soil of Chicago. It's a marshy city. It's a water-based city. And so they were able to build much taller structures, but because they used steel instead of masonry, the buildings had gigantic windows. And this was great for the city merchants. And so the big merchants, Joseph Wanamaker and Marshall Field, hired his firm. They hired Daniel Burnham's firm to build their new stores because they could have these giant display windows that showed people on the street all the wares inside of the shop. And they let a lot of light into the shop that made it a very inviting place for people to visit. So these merchants loved Daniel Burnham because he revitalized their business. He brought new technology, combined it with artistry to create entirely new kinds of buildings for them. And they asked him then to design the 1893 Columbian Exposition, which was a big World's Fair in Chicago that kind of showcased the rebirth, the renaissance of that city. And his comment was that he said, never make small plans. He said, make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood. So he galvanized the whole city and all the architects in that town to think on a grand scale. And eventually, the town fathers in Chicago asked Daniel Burnham to write a city plan, a plan for the city of Chicago. And this was audacious in its scope. And he planned something that affected all the outlying regions. It rebuilt the transportation. He moved the train station. He redesigned the entire city for the future. He had a vision for the future. And that vision combined technology, artistry, the needs of commerce, particularly the merchants who hired him, and the needs of the community. And to me, this is a great template if you're going to rebuild your business And it's something that the retailers in this audience and the real estate developers in this audience might pay